Guys, let's talk about Bismuth. Not just the character, but the episode Bismuth. The first actual special episode of Steven Universe, and maybe the last two, I don't know. Guys, this episode so far is the only episode of this show written specifically to be a 22-minute episode. It had more than one commercial break and was written as a 22-minute solid story. It's not two episodes back-to-back that make a longer episode. It is literally a longer episode of the show, complete with its own special title card and everything. And this is the episode that we got a leaked promo for not too long ago that I did an analysis video on that finally solves the mystery of the gem bubbled inside Lion's mane. And I'm probably going to piss some of you off with this review because I really felt underwhelmed by this episode. Now, calm down. I didn't dislike it. I just felt like it had way more problems than it needed to have. And strangely enough, I'm not going to focus too much on the story of this episode, and hopefully I'll be able to make that clear in a couple minutes as I'm describing my problems with the episode. Basically, during some family time, a series of unfortunate events leads to Steven accidentally releasing Bismuth from her bubble. He doesn't really know who she is or what to do with her, so he describes her to the other crystal gems, and they seem to recognize her, but they're not sure, so they ask him to bring her outside of Lion's Mane, and sure enough, it's their old friend Bismuth. They get reacquainted. They explain to Bismuth that the war is already over. She has been bubbled since very early in the war. She gets to know Steven and Amethyst a little bit. She takes the crystal gems to her forge, where she made all of the material weapons used by the crystal gems during the war, including Rose's sword. She gives the other crystal gems some material add-ons to their holographic summoned weapons that are designed to improve their capabilities a little bit. We learn a little bit about how the crystal gems did things during the rebellion. And then finally, the ending happens, and I'm not going to get into the ending right now. I'm going to talk about it in a little bit. And yeah, a lot more happened in there. There was a lot of stuff. There was a sparring scene. There were a lot of interactions between Bismuth, Pearl, and Garnet. There were some cute domestic-y scenes of Bismuth getting acquainted with how things are now that the war is over, of Bismuth getting to know Steven and not quite believing that Steven isn't just some new version of Rose. But those are the major plot points of this episode. The things that I said are the major plot points of this episode, which brings me to my first problem with this episode. And this is going to sound like a really weird complaint, especially coming from me, but there was too much lore in this episode. Now, if you give me a second, I'm going to try to explain to you what I mean by this. Everything that Bismuth said was lore stuff. All of it, with a handful of exceptions. Even her not quite believing right away that Steven isn't Rose turned out to be lore stuff because it tied into what happened between Bismuth and Rose that we get at the end of the episode. Her getting reacquainted with Pearl and Garnet was lore stuff. Her talking to Amethyst was lore stuff. Yeah, it was contextually worked into conversation, but it still felt forced. It still felt like they were info dumping, that they were giving us exposition, that they were dumping lore details into this episode. It seemed like Bismuth couldn't say two words without having to drop some lore information in there. And I'm not going to get into the lore stuff in this episode, except for one thing that I do want to touch on very briefly in a minute, because I want to save that for other videos down the line, because there was some really interesting stuff here that I do want to think on. But seriously, go back and rewatch the episode, and tell me that a lot of Bismuth's lines didn't sound kind of forced. That they wouldn't have felt a lot more natural if those little tidbits hadn't been dropped into the dialogue. And it wasn't horrible. A lot of it was just the same kind of natural exposition that we get a lot in episodes of Steven Universe. It's just, it was in every single conversation, in every single exchange of dialogue. We got as much lore in this episode as we would in probably half a dozen other episodes. And yet, despite the episode being the first genuine 22-minute episode of the show, comparatively little happened. I would even go so far to say that less happened in this episode than in some of the 11-minute episodes. And yet there were still instances where this episode felt unnatural and rushed. It's actually quite the feat. For example, let's talk about that ending. Bismuth implies early on that she doesn't know what happened, why she was bubbled. But it's hinted all throughout that she's lying and that she's worrying that Steven might know, that he might have Rose's memories and that he's just holding that back from her. And you can kind of tell. It's not 100% apparent, but you can kind of tell. So when the end rolls around and Bismuth starts going on and on about taking the fight to Homeworld and about having this weapon against Homeworld and then shows Steven this weapon that is specifically designed to shatter enemy gems, it's not a surprise when Steven disagrees with this method. Bismuth becomes convinced that Steven is actually Rose because that's exactly what Rose said to her right before Rose poofed her and bubbled her. And now we know why Bismuth was bubbled. It was because she had an opposing opinion to Rose, one which could very easily have divided the crystal gems at a time when they couldn't afford to be divided. Because Bismuth believes that any measures should be taken to defeat the diamonds once and for all, even if that means mowing through gem soldiers and other followers of the diamonds who don't have a choice but to fight for the diamonds. I mean, yeah, I guess she's kind of blaming them for not coming over to Rose's side, but not everyone is going to have the courage to do that. Not everyone is going to have the opportunity to do that. And Rose understood that and considered shattering enemy gems to be an unacceptable course of action. And it doesn't expressly come out and say this, but it was the understanding that some of the crystal gems would have sided with Bismuth and started to follow Bismuth and divided the team, that she fought, poofed, and bubbled Bismuth, hiding her away from everyone. And let's just get this out of the way right off the bat. We know that Bismuth was wrong. We know objectively that she was wrong because we have seen evidence that enemy gems, that homeworld gems, are just victims. And we have seen evidence that homeworld gems can be brought around to thinking more like a crystal gem. We've even seen that gems that don't affiliate themselves directly with the crystal gems can coexist with crystal gems. Objectively speaking, it was wrong for Bismuth to push for killing other gems, with the possible exception of some of the elites and the diamonds. The gems who are pulling the strings, so to speak. But at the end of the day, I also can't really fault Bismuth's way of thinking. In wartime, sometimes you just have to put your reservations aside and fight with everything you have for your people. It really does look like, for whatever reason, the rebellion was fought to a standstill, that it was a draw, and that the only reason any crystal gems still exist is because Rose was able to save them from corruption. Objectively speaking, if this weapon had been used, if this weapon had been distributed amongst the crystal gems and used against Homeworld, they might have won. Yes, they would have done a lot of damage, but they might have reached the diamonds, defeated them, and freed everyone. So at the end of the day, neither one of these characters is completely right or completely wrong, and I love that. And yet, I'm going to come right out and say that this episode made me dislike Rose more than I already did. Not because of her opinion that we learn about here at the end of the episode. Like I said, she is both right and wrong. The issue I have with Rose is that she left a traitor where her son would find it. She went out of her way to poof and bubble Bismuth in secret without telling any of the other crystal gems, and then hide her away inside Lion, in the pocket dimension inside Lion, that she obviously intended to leave to Steven. Why? Why did the crew write her to be so irresponsible? It's not like she could have asked Garnet what Bismuth would do to Steven when she was unbubbled in the future, if she ever was, because Garnet didn't know what happened to Bismuth. And fun fact, guys, Lion is a lion. He wasn't alive 5,000 years ago, so he can't be the first place that Rose hid Bismuth. That means that Rose took Bismuth from whatever other hiding place she kept her in first, and specifically put her inside Lion, where Steven would find her. And maybe she didn't expect that Steven would accidentally unbubble her, but that seems like a huge gamble, one that she didn't have to make. It just paints Rose in such a negative light to me, that she would endanger the life of her son for seemingly no reason. The only thing I can think of here is that maybe she thought that Steven might be able to reason with Bismuth. But once again, that's an insane risk to take. Yes, at the end of this episode, Steven is able to use Rose's sword to defeat Bismuth again, and he does bubble her again and then tell the others everything that happened, proving that he's better than Rose in that way, and I'll get to that in a second. But it was close. There was no guarantee that he was going to win that. But then I kind of get the sense that we were supposed to come out of this episode with a lower opinion of Rose, because it's heavily implied that the only reason that the others didn't know what happened to Bismuth is because Rose was too much of a coward to tell them. Yeah, telling everybody what happened during the war still could have divided the crystal gems. That makes sense, and I agree with the decision not to tell anyone what happened to Bismuth back then. But the only reason that she would not have told the others after the war is because she was too afraid of what they would think of her. Which is fine. That's perfectly acceptable. That is a perfectly acceptable way to feel. It doesn't mean it was right to keep it a secret. And so the fact that Steven did have the courage and did know his space moms well enough to trust them with that information means that he has already grown more mature than Rose ever was. At least in some capacities. And that was a great touch to throw in there. It really was. It was fantastic. But I'd be willing to say that that moment was the only wholly satisfying scene in this entire episode. I liked Bismuth. I liked the way she was presented as a character. I liked the way that she's written at the basis level. I thought her voice actor was great. But I already mentioned before that so much lore was crammed into all of her dialogue that it just felt unnatural. I kind of feel like, more so than any other episode in the past, the plot of this episode would have worked better over several episodes. I think it would have worked better if we had gotten just a little bit of this over the course of 3 or maybe 4 episodes where other things were happening too. And then we had gotten the big climax between Steven and Bismuth. And I can't back this up, so take this with a grain of salt, but I kind of get the sense that the crew had a very clear vision of what they wanted this episode to be, and that they probably created that vision way before this episode was produced. That they had all of these moments that they wanted to hit, all these boxes to tick off, and when it came time to actually making the special, they crammed all those in there with less care than they should have had, taking less care than they should have to make sure everything felt natural to us, because they'd been thinking about it for so long that it already felt natural to them. And I can say that this is something that's happened to me before in my meager attempts at writing in the past. There might be a scenario that I really want to write about. It may be the scenario that I'm shaping the entire story around. But when I get around to finally writing it, I realize that the story has already taken on its own shape and that that scenario doesn't quite fit into the story anymore. So I have to rework it to make it fit more naturally. And I feel like that's what happened here with this episode, except that they didn't rework it as much as they should have. It all comes down once again to the issue of pacing. The pacing is getting better. The pacing issues are getting better, but they are by no means gone. The pacing in this episode was a mess. It was fast moment, slow moment, fast moment, fast moment, fast moment, slow moment, fast moment, slow moment. It moved so fast for a while in there that some of the scenes just kind of run together in your head. Scenes that should have been really distinct and memorable. There was also some stuff in here, and this is the one lore issue that I do want to discuss in this video. There was some stuff here where Bismuth was dropping what felt like lore details, but I'm not really sure that they actually were. It felt more like she was just using gem colloquialisms. And while it's cool to see something like that, while it's cool to get a little bit of gem distinct lingo in the show, some of it was just outright confusing. Not much of it, just a little bit, and it was subtle, except for one thing. At one point, Bismuth calls rose quartz just another quartz made right here in the dirt. And this has already got a lot of people saying that Rose was made on Earth. But that's not possible, unless the crew is intending to completely retcon the timeline. Rose was already alive and active as a crystal gem, too early in the timeline to have been made on Earth. That's not something that's up for debate. It's a fact. Which means that when Bismuth said that, she was being figurative. But there are a lot of people who are taking it literally. And again, like I said, this may be indicative of some retconning that is to come, that the timeline is being reworked in some way, in which case I'll eat my words. But as the lore stands now, it's not possible for Rose to have been made on Earth. And I will even go so far as to say that I've already watched the next episode, Beta, and evidence in that episode supports this, that it's not possible for Rose to have been made on Earth. I may talk about this in more detail at some point. I honestly don't know. I've got a lot of stuff I want to talk about. But I want to keep that in mind, that Bismuth was being figurative there, and that she was probably being figurative in a few other areas throughout the episode. And I mentioned earlier how great Bismuth's voice actress was. I want to compliment her again, because she really was fantastic. The character had a distinct charm to her. Even though she did attack Steven at the end, seemingly with the intention of killing him, I still came out of the episode liking her. Even though a lot of her dialogue felt kind of unnatural, I still came out of the episode liking her. And considering how much of the dialogue felt unnatural to me, that is a true testament to the talent of the voice actress. And considering that the episode ends with Bismuth being bubbled again and left in the burning room, I get the sense that we are definitely going to see her again, and that excites me. Even though there were some things that I really didn't like about this episode, it excites me to think that we might be seeing this character again. I know I said I wanted to talk about one lore detail, but I also want to talk about another one very, very briefly. I did mention this very briefly earlier, but I want to reiterate. It was Bismuth who made all of the material weapons used by the crystal gems during the war. Bismuth is the one who forged their weapons. Now, we know that she didn't choose to become a blacksmith until she came to Earth. It's still possible that she learned the techniques that she eventually developed into her forging techniques by watching ancient humans, so humans still contributed to that, since it seems like Homeworld doesn't forge weapons at all. But it is confirmed that that is where all of the material weapons came from. And on a related note, this episode does make a distinction between material weapons and summon gem weapons. This is the first time that it's specifically implied that they're two different things. I know we've seen visual evidence that they're different, but this is the first time that they're called two very specific terms, with the gem weapons just being referred to as weapons and the material weapons being referred to as material weapons. There's probably a lot more I can say about this episode, good and bad, but this review is already running very long, and I want to reiterate, I didn't dislike this episode. I felt that it was far more flawed than it should have been, but I still found enjoyment in watching it. Is it up there amongst my favorite episodes of the show? No, absolutely not. It doesn't even make the top 10, which is disappointing only in so much that this was a special. If this had just been any other random episode, that wouldn't be a big deal. And it was still a good episode. Don't get me wrong, there was still a lot of good in this episode. It was cool getting to see Garnet and Pearl become reacquainted with this gem that they hadn't seen for thousands of years. That was great. Voice acting was great. A lot of the lore was great. I just think it would have been better if it had been drawn out over a few more episodes, if it had been a story arc instead of a special. All of that said, guys, what did you think of this episode? I'm expecting to get some very different opinions than mine down there in the comment section down below. But either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.
Bye-bye.